the easiest win if you can just get them to remove a constraint from an offer. Then if it really is a constraint, maybe you could work into, well, could you deal with something via active network management, or could you do a little bit of reinforcement to overcome that constraint? And that might be worth doing, paying a bit of money for some reinforcement to overcome a constraint. That, there's all sorts of other things that you could start digging into, ways to overcome particular constraints, which is going to be, on a sort of site-by-site basis. But sometimes you don't have to spend huge amounts of money to make quite a significant difference.
Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Road Night Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Connectology podcast. I'm joined by Pete Aston, and we are going to be discussing understanding outage risk. This is the precursor to a webinar which we're recording in a couple of weeks' time, I think. So by the time this goes out, it'll be shortly before that webinar. And that webinar is at 10 o'clock on Wednesday, the 12th of July. So that's 10 o'clock, Wednesday, the 12th of July. And there's going to be an awful lot of material to cover on the webinar. So this podcast is really a way of trailing it, helping people understand who it's for, why we're doing it, what we're going to be covering, and to give you an idea of which of your colleagues, friends or family you might be pointing this in the direction of sharing it with, so that they can be on there. And as many as we can from the sort of the connectology community can get up to speed with this ever growing risk. And I think we'll kind of cover that ever growingness in this podcast. Obviously, if you just tune into the connectology page on the website, you'll see that. First of all, very quickly, why we should be listening to Pete in this regard. So Pete headed up the system planning function at NGED, WPD as was, so responsible for the ongoing design of the extra high voltage network, so that's 33 kV and above, across all 4 license areas. And so this was very much his bag at outages and how to design networks in order to avoid them, essentially. He's definitely, as far as I'm concerned, the right person. He was also responsible for the relationship with National Grid at the transmission distribution boundary, which may or may not be relevant, actually, because I am the lay person in the room and people will be able to put me right. He was also responsible for the rollout of active network management at WPD and NGED. That's quite important because actually there's a big difference between A&M curtailment and abnormal running risk, outage risk, I believe. So hopefully the right person for the job. So hello, Pete.
Hi, Hugh. Nice to be here with you.
Excellent. Or not here, because you're in Bristol and I'm actually in the office, but there we are. So first of all, my reasons for, because it was actually, this podcast was my suggestion, because normally often it comes from the connectologist. And that's because I'm in the office, I hear an awful lot of what's going on in terms of the work we're delivering and the problems we're solving for clients. And there's an increasing amount of conversation that I hear about outage risk, projects that are connected and are suffering significant, as in millions of pounds worth of outage cost in terms of lost revenue from lost energy a year. So really significant issues that we've essentially, or Pete rather, Pete, Philip, Catherine being parachuted in order to overcome these issues. And so I've become very conscious that it's something that is kind of slipping through the net, maybe isn't yet, will be coming more within the consciousness of the developer community as they hear these horror stories, and as sort of development directors and investment directors decide that they need to be up to speed with this in order that they're not the next one to get support by it. And the other thing is actually an awful lot of projects. First of all, the team here are identifying, but also mitigating these risks. So that risk of missing out on significant levels of income from projects, they're finding ways around them. And that's either for projects that are accepted schemes or projects that are connected. So I thought, wow, this sounds like a thing. And we discussed it a little bit on the webinar on understanding DNO curtailment reports the other day. So do have a look at that one on the Connectology page. And so we thought, right, we'll do this properly instead of just touching on it briefly. So that's kind of why. Who this is for, I would say, very much for the likes of development directors, investment directors, people who are either making calls on significant levels of development risk capital going into projects, people who are acquiring projects as well, just to make sure that they understand sort of where the risks are. I guess how to manage the likes of Road Knight Taylor and other professional advisors in this area, and just really inform the decision making of the sort of the community as a whole. So that's the why, I guess. Sorry, we haven't actually heard anything from Pete yet. That's the why and the who. And Pete, first of all, I know that you're involved in one project which is been connected for years, and you're in there helping the client. Do you want to, without giving away any sort of commercially sensitive details, just give me sort of a very brief overview of that as a case study in the level of risk that developers could be facing?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. So I think in terms of what I've been working on recently, so connection, like I say, has been connected for well over 10 years, seeing an increasing level of constraints, outage constraints. So there's outage constraints for this particular connection that have been built into the connection agreement. So they were there in the connection offer originally, built into the connection agreement, and for a while at least, didn't really play a major part in the overall picture of that connection until outages started happening on the network of quite a significant duration, for repair, maintenance, upgrade of the network. So that, I guess that's one thing to bear in mind, is that from what I've seen on this particular one, this issue can lie dormant in a connection agreement for some time, giving a sort of false sense of security until it starts to bite.
Like a ticking time bomb.
A bit like a ticking time bomb. So yeah, on this particular connection, sort of over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been quite significant outages relating to this is a 132 connection relating to the rebuild of various 132 kV overhead lines. So I think that's amounted to, in the order of a couple of £1 million worth of cost in terms of lost revenue on this particular site over the last 5 or 6 years. So that in and of itself is bad news for that particular connection. The real hammer blows come this year in this particular site being told that they're going to be off supply for between 6 and 7 months next year.
Wow.
In total, due to the rebuild of a particular 132 kV substation, and that's going to result in multi-million pound losses, lost revenue over that particular period. So, which is of course an absolute hammer blow for that particular connection. So that's what I'm dealing with that particular scheme, trying to work with the network company, work with the developer to try and think of ways around that. But this one's particularly bad, but there could be other schemes out there that look equally as bad as this one.
Right. Sounds quite frightening. And this is a 132 kV connected project, and historically, if you go back to sort of up until 2015, when the renewables incentives for utility scale projects were essentially sort of abolished by that Conservative government, up to that point, most of the projects were connecting at 11 and 33 kV. if you look through the ECR, so that's the embedded capacity register, we can put a link in the description. The ECRs of the different network operators now, the number of projects that are connecting at 132. So first of all, lots of 132 kV projects, and lots of them kind of maxing out up to that, particularly for solar, 50 megawatt AC. Is there likely to be, therefore, not only a growing scale of risk as they're bigger projects, so the lost income per hour, I guess, is going to be greater? Is it likely to be a growth in the number of projects that are potentially carrying one of these ticking time bombs along with them?
Yes, I think so, because, like you say, historically under the feed-in tariff scheme and the renewable obligation certificate schemes, so the ROCs, they very strongly incentivize connections sort of up to about 5 megawatts, occasionally a bit bigger. So there were lots of schemes 2017 and before that that were 5 megawatt scale, which were typically 33 kV connected. So like you say, we've now got lots of 132 and potentially 66 kV connections at distribution level, where there could very well be a lot of constraints, outage risk constraints in those offers. And at 132 kV, things just take a long time. You know, tower painting circuits can be out for quite a long time just to paint towers. And so tower painting is one that's just, you know, one of many things that could take out a connection for quite a long period of time. You know, there's all sorts of other things. Every type of asset replacement maintenance takes longer at 132 kV than it does at 33 kV and 11 kV. And I think it's worth saying to you as well, we're seeing an increasing amount of this sort of thing at transmission level as well. So it isn't just distribution schemes. Um, Historically, transmission schemes have been very big generators, you know, big coal-fired power stations, nuclear sites, and so on, who will have multiple circuits into a site, more security to them than just a single circuit connection. A lot of the schemes that we're seeing now at transmission are tee-offs from overhead lines, connections into bits of bus bar that get switched off when there are circuit outages or transformer outages. So the sorts of things that we could see at distribution level at 132 kV, we can also see at transmission level, and often these are uncompensated constraints at
So
transmission as well.
oh, right, that's something, as the clearly the amateur here. Um, I just assumed that if you were constrained due to an outage, abnormal running at transmission level, that you would be compensated. But that's not the case then.
No, so there are lots of situations at transmission where if there is an outage and you are constrained off, that you would be compensated. Um, but if it's the connection arrangement whereby you are effectively teed off a circuit and that circuit is switched off, but basically in the connection offer at transmission, that would be classed as sort of an outage that you wouldn't be compensated for. So these things exist at transmission level, and at transmission level, the other one is that tertiary connections, where these sorts of effectively outage constraints really bite hard. So there are all sorts of things at transmission and distribution level that effectively come under the same bracket.
Right. That is quite frightening, because you're looking at, therefore, even greater risk just because of the scale of investment, and so the potential lost energy
Yeah.
on
Well,
in any given half hour.
yeah,
So
if you think about it at transmission level, if you're a tertiary winding connection, for example, and a transformer that you're connected to faults, the supergrid transformer replacement is probably at least 6 months, if not more. You know, so you're sitting on a potential long outage delay, you know, from the word go with a tertiary connection, and the same with lots of other type of connections as well. So these things are baked into a lot of connections, lots of connection designs, and you have to look a little bit further afield than just the assets you're connected to as well. So there's clearly if you're the situation where you're connected to an asset, that asset gets switched out, you obviously go off supply, and you know, that's the really obvious one. The less obvious ones are where there are wider constraints that you are then subject to, which is like the circuit that's, you know, 30 miles away. When that one's switched out, you get intertripped off, or just constrained off by a control engineer, and then you're off for the duration of the outage. They're the ones that I think tend to get missed because they end up going into the small print. You've got to look right to the end of the offer to work out what they're actually saying about that. And they're the ones where I think there's probably more risk of developers not picking up some of those constraints.
If you're liking this podcast so far, you may want to pop over to the Connectology page on Road Night Taylor's website and sign up to the Connectology newsletter for much more know-how, insight and thought leadership in electricity network connections. The link to this is in the description. Don't miss out on any of the articles, explainers, videos, webinars and podcasts that Road Night Taylor's connectologists share to give you an edge and help you overcome your grid frustrations. And I guess the other thing is understanding when you're looking at one of those constraints is being able to put some numbers, some estimates around that constraint, because actually if it's just talking about n-1 condition or such and such a circuit, that might not mean anything to most people. And I guess that could be why so many of these projects that those risks slip through the net at due diligence. And, I know that we've been working on some projects where they did go through due diligence and obviously came to us after the event. Yeah, easy to miss.
Absolutely. Yeah, really easy to miss. So some of these constraints are literally stuck in the middle of paragraphs or, at the end of documents. Really, these sorts of constraints should be pulled out right at the front of an offer and go, these are the things that you could be turned off for. This is really significant. Here's all the historical outage information for you to make an informed decision for your connection. But that is generally not the way it happens. It's generally, especially at distribution level, I think it's a bit better at transmission. They're a little bit clearer about it. But at distribution level, this information can get stuck anywhere in an offer, and it's really quite crucial to read like all of it, especially that and they always, each of the DNOs generally puts it in certain places, so you end up knowing where to look, but it really can easily be missed, and it's so much easier to deal with it before you connect your site rather than afterwards, which is why you sort of talk about that due diligence stage is so important, because once you're connected, you've invested, and you still have to try and make the best of that investment. Whereas at least at due diligence stage, you can make the decision not to progress if you think the risk is too high. But once you have identified the risk, you've really then got to work to either try and get historical outage data from the DNO, which they should provide. They won't always, but you'll have to try and work at that, and then you're trying to understand, well, from that historical data, what does it mean for the future? Were the last 10 years representative of what could happen in the future? If the last 10 years have been really easy, no major works, you could again be lulled into a false sense of security by historic data. So historic data is good, but it doesn't tell you what's going to happen in the future. So you've got to then layer on top of that some general thoughts around maintenance periods, fault rates, etc. So you've really got to work quite hard to understand what the real outage risk is all about.
And I guess even harder once you've identified that outage risk to come up with a credible resolution to that, a way of mitigating it that you can actually sell to the system planner at that network operator.
Yeah, and sometimes we've seen constraints thrown into connection offers that just feel like it's the DNO trying to cover their backs. It's like, well, here's a list of constraints. I saw I saw one constraint in an offer that I was reviewing a few weeks back that just basically said you'll be constrained for any 132 kV outage. When I was talking to the client about this, I was like, I mean, is this any 132 kV outage anywhere in the world, or is it specific to the UK only, or a certain bit of the network? So you can't work with that until you start talking to the DNO, going, what does this mean? What were you trying to achieve by saying this? And sometimes it's a case of they didn't really know, but they just thought they probably should write something in an offer just to cover themselves. So, which isn't very helpful. So you've then at that point you've got to start digging in with the DNO. Well, what do they really mean? And can they potentially just, limit that? What change the offer? I mean, that's the easiest thing is just go actually write what you meant, or what you really need, not just everything. So that's the easiest win if you can just get them to remove a constraint from an offer. Then, if it really is a constraint, maybe you could work into, well, could you deal with something via active network management, or could you do a little bit of reinforcement to overcome that constraint? And that might be worth doing, paying a bit of money for some reinforcement to overcome a constraint. That there's all sorts of other things that you could start digging into, ways to overcome particular constraints, which is going to be on a sort of site by site basis. But
Yeah.
sometimes you don't have to spend huge amounts of money to make quite a significant difference.
And I guess that's the thing, and this just jogged my memory. Actually, I was on a call with Catherine and two investment directors, and they were grilling Catherine about a constraint on a project, and it made me realise that for investment directors, the level of expertise that you need in order to get the best out of advisors, consultants, in order that you can do the math, in order that, first of all, you can decide whether or not you want to acquire a project, but also, and this kind of loops into what you're talking about, to work out what your budget is going to be in order to mitigate that risk. Because if you're prepared to invest 50, 100 million in a project, then you might be very ready to invest another couple of $100,000 or maybe even a couple of million in order to get X percent, to squeeze X percent greater income out of that project. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, because there'll be some schemes where it doesn't make sense. There'll be some schemes where you go, to solve this problem, you have to spend a few million. But if that's a 15 megawatt 33 kV connection, that might be completely disproportionate. And you go, well, actually, maybe that's one to not proceed with, which I think is a very, very valuable thing to know, to know that signal to not proceed, as well as it is to say, yeah, actually spending a few 100,000 on this scheme will make this viable and proceedable. You need to get into that so that you've got that sense of proportion as to what you could spend to mitigate the problem. And there'll be lots of times when you can mitigate the problem. There'll be certain times when you can't, and you've just got to be able to get to the bottom of the issue and to work out what the issue is and how you deal with it.
Cool. Good. Excellent. Thank you very much, Pete. And just, you mentioned 33 kV back then. So, because I've been kind of majoring on the 132, and then you mentioned transmission as well. But just looking at those sort of 33, and there'll be projects at 66 as well. Do they suffer outage risk, and are those risks sometimes mitigatable?
Yeah, most common outage risk at 33 kV is where a connection sits on a circuit that forms an interconnector between two different bulk supply points, two different BSPs. And what can often happen is that interconnector is used to transfer demand from one BSP to another during, let's say, grid transformer outages. And often constraints are written such that if a grid transformer is switched out and your interconnector is effectively moved onto the other substation, you'll be turned off. And of course, grid transformer outages happen quite regularly. So I've certainly seen it when I worked for a DNO, that customers were turned off quite regularly as these interconnectors were sort of switched around between the different BSPs. So very much can happen at 33 kV. We managed to solve one issue with one of these connections by installing a 15 grand isolator, 33 kV disconnector in a line, and that reduced a particular connection's outage risk by weeks and weeks for every year.
Wow.
It's like, well,
So
it's a no-brainer, isn't
so
it?
the return on investment for that fix would have been,
Oh,
then
huge.
you wouldn't get a better return on investment.
No, can then at times. give you that flexibility of feeding both ways. And if you can do that at application stage, it's so much the better. It resolves all of those sort of post offer discussion
Okay.
processes.
And if you, let's say you haven't, and there are going to be, I mean, because obviously we see an awful lot of connection offers where others have made the applications, and we do know that there are many missed opportunities and weaknesses. So let's say we've got um, some in the audience listening to this and who will be on the webinar. If they've got a load of offers and they haven't taken those precautions, can you actually address these after the event? So, I mean, obviously, if you were to kind of reapply, if you were to wanted to increase your capacity, change technology, change a red line boundary, whatever, then that's not an allowable change. If you wanted to convert to a looped connection or put an inline isolator in or get a reconfiguration of the network, maybe even go so far as to say, what if it would be a bit of reinforcement? What would it be?
Is it possible to have those conversations? I think it is. Um, the risk is that the DNO goes, right, well, this is a brand new offer. I'm tearing up your existing one. You go to the back of the queue. So it's really working out how you can make that request. Because if a DNO, if you've got T-off connection, for example, a DNO will probably not have considered you feeding one direction and not the other, or whatever. That they're assuming if the circuit you're connected to is out, you're out, and you're not going to be able to feed either direction during the outage. If you say, well, I want a line isolator between me and the substation down the road, so that if the substation down the road's got transformer maintenance, the isolator can be opened and I can be kept on supply. The DNO might not have considered that in their original design process, so they might need to then consider that. So I think if a DNO isn't willing to engage on doing that sort of reinforcement work in order to avoid constraints, then it's definitely a conversation to take further up the chain.
So lots to play for. I'm conscious of the fact that was meant to be a very, very short podcast, and we appear to be hugely making love to this. It's great, by the way, to be discussing it with you. First of all, when it comes to the podcast, there's going to be a couple of case studies. I know that Philip's got a really good one. We did some work, identified a huge number of constraints on a project, but then worked with the network operator to mitigate those constraints. And I think it went down from something like 6% loss of income down to about 3%. So, and that's I guess the kind of thing that people tend to focus on A&M curtailment risk, where they get a number from the network operator. You don't get that with constraints. You just get potentially in the small print that there might be something going to happen. So that's a really good case study. There's another one that Philip did actually for one of my projects here at Landowner. We secured some capacity for when he put a switched alternative in place, and that I think had a huge impact where it made the project viable when it wouldn't have been otherwise. I mean, other than the fact that I think what I have got out of this conversation is that there are an increasing number of ticking time bombs out there. Some of them you should be able to identify by being very, very careful. And if you're going looking for IEDs, I guess you're going to be very vigilant. You need to be looking for very fine details and understanding what you're seeing. So there are increasing number of ticking time bombs out there with a greater level of impact. So I guess the charge is even greater than it would have been, because we're talking about very big projects. Some of them you can diffuse, and so that's great. For example, having you parachuted into that project that you're working on at the moment. Some of them you can diffuse, that's great. Some of them you simply can't, and I guess that's where you just got to stand well back, just get back as far as you can. And I think that really is about due diligence, about identifying them at that point, or even not putting the application in the first place, because obviously, oftentimes, a lot of the time, you can see that there is going to be that outage associated with it. So, first of all, do you agree with that? And secondly, is there anything else you'd like to add before we call it quits and say we look forward to seeing everybody on the webinar.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. And I think, just worth finishing on, it's the longer you leave it, the harder it is to deal with. So, if you can sort it at application stage, it's easier than post acceptance, which is easier than post connection. It gets harder and harder to deal with. So get it sorted up front if you can. If not, deal with it through due diligence. But yeah, I do think you're absolutely right.
Brilliant.
I like your analogy.
Thank you. And Pete, I know that you gave me a whole load of questions I was meant to ask you, and I haven't asked you any of them because I thought you'd end up doing the webinar 2 weeks ahead and on a podcast and without Philip. So apologies for that, but thank you. I think that's been great. Thank you everybody for listening. Do get that you have to invest a lot of your time in these, and we really, really hope that you do feel that you get valuable insight from it. And Pete, thank you so much. And would you like to thank the audience and say goodbye to you?
Thank you very much for listening, and hopefully you'll tune in again for the next one.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Connectology podcast. If you found it helpful, please share it with any of your colleagues or connections you think may be interested. And please do subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your content. You can find out more about our services at roadnighttailor.co.uk, link in the description, where you can also sign up to our free Connectology newsletter for more news and thought leadership in network connections. If, during this podcast, you found yourself wondering what it would be like to have a Road Night Tailor connectologist in your life, please do email laura@roadnighttailor.co.uk to find out how their game-changing skills and insight can change the game for you too.